Ever wondered how to take the perfect shot with your camera? The secret lies in the mastery of exposure settings. Yes, those dials and numbers that may seem daunting at first, but are in reality your magic wands to capture the world as you see it. Understanding exposure settings is crucial for photography. It's like learning to play an instrument, each setting playing a unique note in harmony with the others to create the perfect melody, or in this case, the perfect shot. Let's break it down into three main settings: aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. Think of aperture as your camera's iris, controlling the amount of light and the depth of field. Shutter speed, on the other hand, is your camera's eyelid, capturing motion and freezing time. Finally, ISO is like your camera's sensitivity to light, affecting the brightness and noise level of your photos. These settings are not independent of each other, but work together, balancing and complementing each other to get that picture-perfect shot. Whether you're chasing sharpness or motion blur, it's all about playing with these settings. Stay tuned as we dive into each of these settings in more detail. First up, let's decode the mystery of the aperture. The aperture, my friends, is a gateway that controls how much light gets to dance onto your camera's sensor. Picture this, if you will, a window in a dark room. The larger the window, the more light fills the room. Similarly, a wide aperture lets in more light and a narrow one less. But it's not just about light, oh no, the aperture also influences the depth of field. That's the range in your image that appears sharp. A wide aperture creates a shallow depth of field. It keeps your subject in focus, while the background gently blurs away, perfect for portraits or isolating details in a busy scene. A narrow aperture, on the other hand, gives you a larger depth of field, bringing more of the scene into sharp focus. Ideal for landscapes or architectural shots where you want a lot of detail. Now you might be wondering, how do I know when to use a wide or narrow aperture? Well, imagine you're photographing a beautiful butterfly resting on a flower. You'd want the butterfly sharp and the background to blur out, wouldn't you? For that, a wide aperture is your best friend. But if you're capturing the grandeur of a mountain range, you'd want every craggy detail in focus. And for that, a narrow aperture is the way to go. However, remember that a wider aperture means more light, and that could overexpose your image in bright conditions. Conversely, a narrow aperture may not let in enough light in darker scenarios. It's a delicate balancing act, and that's where your shutter speed and ISO come into play, but we'll get to those in a moment. So remember, aperture controls light and depth of field, making it a key player in your photographic journey. Moving on, it's time to unmask the shutter speed. Let's think of the shutter in your camera as a curtain that opens and closes. The shutter speed is simply the length of time this curtain remains open when taking a photograph. It's a crucial component in capturing motion. Imagine you're photographing a hummingbird in flight. If the shutter remains open for too long, the bird's wings would appear blurred in the photo. This is due to the bird's wings moving while the shutter is open. This effect is called motion blur, and it's one way to capture the sense of speed and movement in your photos. On the other hand, if the shutter opens and closes in the blink of an eye, the flight of the hummingbird is frozen in time, every detail of its wings sharp and clear. This is referred to as a freeze frame. Now you might be thinking, great, I'll just always use a fast shutter speed to get clear pictures. If only it were that simple. You see, the shutter speed doesn't work alone. It's part of a trio of settings that need to be balanced to get the perfect shot. This trio includes the aperture and ISO, which we'll delve into later. Here's the catch: the faster the shutter speed, the less time light has to reach your camera sensor. So unless you're photographing in bright sunlight, a fast shutter speed can result in underexposed or dark pictures. Conversely, a slow shutter speed allows more light in, but remember our hummingbird? Its wings would be a blur. So it's all about finding the perfect balance. It's about understanding the environment you're in, the subject you're capturing, and adjusting your settings accordingly. It's about using a slow shutter speed to capture the graceful flow of a waterfall, or using a fast shutter speed to freeze the action at a football game. So whether you're capturing the speed of light or a snail's pace, shutter speed is your go-to setting. Last but not least, let's unravel the intricacies of ISO. Diving straight in, ISO in the world of photography refers to the sensitivity of your camera's sensor to light. You can think of it as a dimmer switch that either amplifies the brightness of your images or tones it down. But there's a catch. Along with brightness, ISO also impacts the noise in your photos. The higher the ISO, the more the noise or graininess. Now, you might be wondering, when should you use low or high ISO settings? Well, the answer largely depends on the lighting conditions at hand. In situations where there's plenty of light, such as a sunny day at the beach or a well-lit room, it's advisable to keep the ISO low. This will give you crisp, noise-free images. On the other hand, when you find yourself in dimly lit scenarios like a candle-lit dinner or a cityscape during twilight, cranking up the ISO becomes necessary. This will brighten up your shot without having to compromise on the shutter speed or aperture. But remember, this comes at the cost of increased noise in your photos. So, what's the golden rule here? Try to maintain a low ISO for better image quality whenever you can. Use higher ISO settings as a last resort. When increasing the aperture or slowing the shutter speed just won't do the trick. And here's a little pro tip. Using a tripod or a lens with a wider aperture can help you achieve the desired effects without having to increase the ISO. This way you can keep the noise at bay while still getting that perfect shot, even in low light conditions. So in essence, ISO is your magic wand for controlling brightness and noise in your images. Now that we've decoded each setting, let's talk about striking the right balance. Imagine your camera as a three-legged stool. Each leg represents aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. If one leg is too short or too long, the stool wobbles. It's the same with your camera settings. To get a well-exposed photo, you must balance these three settings. Let's start with aperture. It controls the amount of light and depth of field. If you want a sharp foreground and a blurry background, a wider aperture is your go-to. But remember, a wider aperture means more light entering the lens, so you'll need to balance it with a faster shutter speed or a lower ISO. Speaking of shutter speed, it's all about capturing motion. A fast shutter speed freezes action while a slow one creates motion blur. If you're shooting a moving subject like a sprinting cheetah, go for a faster shutter speed. But if you're aiming for that silky water effect in a waterfall, a slower shutter speed is your best bet. Again, it's all about balance. A faster shutter speed means less light, so you might need to compensate with a wider aperture or a higher ISO. Now onto ISO. It affects the brightness and noise of your image. A higher ISO makes your photo brighter but also introduces more noise. It's a lifesaver in low-light conditions, but a potential threat to image quality in bright environments. Keep it as low as possible for the best image quality and only crank it up when necessary. Finally, here's a tip. Always start by deciding what's most important for your shot. Is it the depth of field, the motion, or the light? Once you've decided, adjust your settings to achieve that, and then balance the other two. Remember, the perfect shot lies in the balance of aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. So we've shed light on the three pillars of exposure settings. We've delved into the depths of aperture, the gatekeeper of light, and the maestro of depth of field. We've explored the realms of shutter speed, the timekeeper of motion, capturing the world as a still image or a whirl of motion. And we've decoded the mystery of ISO, the balance beam of brightness and noise, helping us adapt to the whims of light conditions. Understanding these elements is not just about technical mastery, it's about enhancing your creative expression. It's the difference between capturing an image and creating a photograph. It's about fine-tuning sharpness or embracing motion blur, about maintaining image quality or adapting to low-light conditions. It's about knowing when to use a tripod, when to choose a wider aperture lens, and when to push the boundaries of ISO. Remember, photography is an art, and these settings are your tools. Like an artist with a palette, you have the freedom to mix and match, to experiment and explore until you achieve your desired effect. So, armed with this knowledge, you're all set to capture the world through your lens. Happy shooting!